Welcome to Piercing the Veil. I'm Daniel Viger. We're living in a time in human history when much of the world is living in wealth, luxury, and an age of consumerism, the likes of which we've never seen before. But there's still death from preventable disease and starvation in large numbers. According to UNICEF, around 3.1 million children per year are dying of malnutrition, while approximately 2.1 billion people are obese or overweight. While there are still many people living in abject poverty, the vast majority of people in the first world live in luxury when compared with any other time in Earth's history. And this includes even the poor people in most first world countries. They have luxuries that even the richest people would not have had not that long ago. For instance, around 95% of Americans have a cell phone. Basically, the point is that the poorest people in rich countries are nowhere near as poor as the poorest people in poor countries. And this world structure leads to an interesting question, and that is, if you are among the class of people living in luxury, which I am, and if you are listening to this, almost certainly you are as well, by the fact that you have access to a computer or a cell phone and have enough time to spend watching podcast episodes rather than having to spend all of your time trying to secure enough calories for yourself or your family to make it to the next day. So if you're a member of this class, the question that's raised is, what obligations do you have to the poorest of the poor? And we aren't talking about legal obligations here, but what does morality require? How much of your wealth and luxurious lifestyle do you need to give up to those who have absolutely nothing? Again, the poorest of the poor, in order for you to be considered a good person. A particularly famous answer to this question is philosopher Peter Singer's extreme demand of morality. And as the name implies, the answer is extreme. Morality requires you give a whole heck of a lot. And Singer's answer is so disturbing because it seems to go from very basic moral principles that seem undeniable to a conclusion that seems morally outrageous. Although there's multiple possible formulations for the extreme demand, the one I'm going to be operating with is the following. One has moral obligations to donate their time and money to help those facing extreme suffering up until the point that the donor is sacrificing something of comparable moral worth to the benefits that the donations are conferring. That's the extreme demand of morality. And because, as Singer makes clear, it's an empirical fact that a relatively small donation can play an instrumental role in saving a child's life somewhere in the world, the extreme demand places moral obligations on those from affluent societies to sacrifice an incredible amount, to the point where any further sacrifice would be morally comparable to the death of a child. Effectively, the extreme demand notes that it is the nature of the world we live in that the opportunity cost of every decision an individual makes can be measured in terms of the lives of children, and then draws the natural conclusion from this fact. So the argument for the extreme demand has three main premises. The first, P1, is that extreme suffering is bad. The second, P2, is that if one can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, one has moral obligations to do so. Premise 3, in today's world, it is always possible for an individual to donate their time and money in such a way as to prevent extreme suffering. And the conclusion is the extreme demand of morality. And we can notice that this is a valid argument. If one accepts the three premises, then they're committed to the extreme demand. So if you want to reject the conclusion, you'll have to find a way to reject at least one of the three premises. Now, premise one seems simply undeniable. When we say extreme suffering on the global scale, we're talking about children starving to death and dying from horrendous diseases. This is bad. If we can't agree as human beings that this is bad, we can't really agree on anything in terms of morality, and we fall into a very dangerous place of moral relativism. So it's going to be very tough to take issue with P1, that extreme suffering is bad. Now, P3 is empirical in nature, but seems to be accurate, and I'm at least going to operate on the relatively uncontroversial assumption that at any given time, there's some aid agency that one could give to that would contribute extremely importantly to the alleviation of extreme suffering. Oxfam and UNICEF are a couple of examples. So this leaves premise 2, which intuitively seems quite plausible. And indeed, Singer drives our intuitions for the acceptance of P2 by using various thought experiments like saving a drowning child, even if it will dirty your nice shoes. And this is the pond analogy, which we'll discuss at length a little bit later in the episode. So it seems very difficult to say that there aren't moral obligations to prevent extreme suffering in such cases, which highlights the fact that we tend to view P2 as an accurate moral principle. If something truly awful is happening and we can prevent that awful thing without something awful happening to us, we may not be legally required to prevent that awful thing, but it seems like morally we ought to, and that we'd be bad if we didn't. There's a very compelling moral argument for the extreme demand that's difficult to deny. But although it's difficult to find a hole in the argument that leads to the extreme demand, accepting it brings about a host of highly unappealing conclusions. As the name implies, morality becomes incredibly burdensome. Professor in philosophy and economics James Addison puts the point quite nicely when he says that an implication of this position is that I am immoral if I buy a gift for my wife on her birthday, or if I pay for my son to have piano lessons, or if I buy a ribbon for my daughter to put in her hair. So despite the fact that basic moral intuitions led us to the extreme demand, basic moral intuitions tell us that its conclusions appear morally absurd. The task then becomes to find where Singer went wrong in arriving at the extreme demand. There have been a number of attempts people have made to try to avoid the unattractive conclusions from the extreme demand without violating the intuitions that led us there, and I want to explore a couple of these before getting to my own take on the problem. Garrett Cullety's response, I believe, is to not actually deny any of the premises of the extreme demand, but to try to deny that the absurd conclusions that seem to be entailed by the extreme demand actually follow from it. In other words, I take him to be arguing that the extreme demand of morality is in fact not so extreme. He begins by describing intrinsically life-enhancing goods, which are, this is a quote from him, goods like friendship, achievements in the pursuit of worthwhile personal projects, and involvement in the life of one's community, goods the possession of which involves attitudes of personal partiality, end quote. So goods that make a decent human life require the agent to be partial in important ways. So even from an impartial moral perspective, it's highly important that there are moral reasons for an agent to behave partially, because without that ability to give preference to the important people and project in one's life, every life would be miserable. So there are then very strong moral reasons to pursue these life-enhancing goods. What Cullety's argument rests on is the further claim that these life-enhancing goods are of comparable moral importance to life itself. This is a quote again. What is most important for most of us is that our lives are vehicles for the fulfillments that a well-lived life can contain. These fulfillments are the ones that a person gains through possessing what I have been calling life-enhancing goods, end quote. The idea is that sheer existence may be intrinsically valuable, but it's not necessarily more valuable than the things in addition to existence that actually make a life worth living. If right, then helping someone or oneself achieve life-enhancing goods is of comparable moral importance to saving someone's life, particularly if the person who is saved is unlikely to live a life with those life-enhancing goods. We can thus avoid the radical implications of the extreme demand because we no longer have to sacrifice much of the important things in our lives, like friendship and worthwhile projects of personal achievement, in order to save lives. In sacrificing our important projects, we would, on this view, be sacrificing something of similar moral importance to the benefits that we'd be conferring, and so we wouldn't be required to make such a sacrifice even on the extreme demand. By claiming that our important personal partiality is of such a high moral importance, Cullity is able to avoid the very burdensome and unattractive implications, or alleged implications, as I should say, of the extreme demand without having to deny the principle itself. Similarly to Cullity, Addison denies that the interest in life of those suffering is necessarily more morally important than the personal projects of those who are better off. Addison makes this claim by arguing that it's impossible to articulate a notion of comparative value in such a way as to make P2 of the argument for the extreme demand coherent. As he argues, the claim that one's projects are not as morally important as saving a life overseas depends on the assumption that one values their projects less than the person overseas values their life. And this assumption can't be made because, this is a quote, each act of valuation is relative to a particular agent, end quote. So for questions like, again, this is a quote, is that trinket you're about to spend money on worth more to you than, say, getting a meal is worth to a hungry Bengali? No such direct comparison can be made, end quote. Well, Cullity claimed that radical implications did not follow from the extreme demand because projects of partiality, like the life-enhancing goods, are morally important. Addison avoids the challenge of justifying the moral importance of our projects altogether by simply saying that the type of comparison on which the extreme demand depends can't be done at all. But it still seems difficult to claim that we can't know the kinds of preventable extreme suffering that occur in much of the developing world are at a level of importance well above most of the things that we choose to do with our resources. To say we can't compare individual valuations of goods may or may not be true when two consumers are assessing luxury goods, but to suppose we can't do so when one is assessing the value of something instrumental to their basic needs and one is assessing the value of a luxury good seems absurd. The claim that we can't know whether someone starving values a meal more than someone who has their basic needs met values a trinket just seems to be utterly false. Similarly, to claim higher level personal projects have comparable moral importance to meeting basic needs and the avoidance of extreme suffering seems like a reaching attempt to justify the inequality and advantage that members of the first world have in order to avoid the rigors of the extreme demand. Although Cullity and Addison give some thought-provoking proposals, when thinking about the situation critically and objectively, it really does seem like we could give quite a lot before what we give costs us something comparable to the benefits we would be conferring, in which case the radical conclusions of the extreme demand have not been avoided. Whether there's merit or not to these types of proposals, like the ones given by Cullity and Addison, if we can give an account that does not put extreme suffering on par with projects that would be considered luxuries to much of the developing world, and that still can avoid the radical conclusions that seem to be drawn from the extreme demand, then I think that seems to be the account that we ought to prefer, and that is the account that I'm going to now try to give. I think that many of the issues with the extreme demand and the absurdity of the conclusions that seem to follow from it arise because of the unwarranted assumption that people who fail to meet the extreme demand are necessarily immoral. But when we understand the extreme demand as a condition that an ideal moral being would meet, and understand an individual's morality as falling on a continuum rather than belonging to a small number of discrete categories, we can both accept the intuitive moral argument that led to the extreme demand and understand the conclusions that can be drawn from the extreme demand in an intuitive way. The tension between the conclusions and the argument can be eased. One thing Singer notes is how charity and aid for those in need is extremely linked to our standard moral thinking. Essentially all major religious traditions have charity as a centerpiece to them. There seems to be a universal understanding that a strong component of morality is giving what you do not need to those who need it more than you do. As Singer says, there's nothing new about the idea that we have a strong moral obligation to help those in need. The extreme demand is simply an extension of an idea that has been central to our moral thinking throughout the course of human history. In fact, it seems highly likely that when asked to describe the ideal moral person, many people would come up with something similar to someone who meets the extreme demand. It intuitively seems like a fully perfect moral person would go through extreme levels of personal sacrifice to do what was in their power to help the people who needed it most. As a condition for being a perfect moral being, the extreme demand does not seem to be a radical claim at all, but rather a highly intuitive one. The ideal moral being would meet the extreme demand, and non-ideal moral beings would fall short of meeting the extreme demand. It seems reasonable to assume that no person is in fact an ideal moral being, and so when understood in this way, it seems in fact necessary that no one actually meets the extreme demand. In fact, the thought that a substantial number of people would fulfill their moral obligations to the point that they could not possibly do anything else to make them a better person seems completely ridiculous. Let us take Christianity as an example to illustrate this point and drive the intuition that the extreme demand is a very reasonable condition for an ideal moral being. Presumably, if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus was essentially an ideal moral being. And if you were to examine Christians' beliefs about his life, you would get something like an individual that actually does meet the extreme demand. Of course, any Christian would say that regular humans, while they can act morally, will never be as moral as Jesus was. It really does seem to be part of our moral intuition that to be fully moral is incredibly burdensome, as the extreme demand is, and that people will fail to take on all of the burdens that are required of them to be a fully moral agent. And in fact, as a condition for a perfect moral being, it would be shocking and unintuitive if the extreme demand wasn't very extreme. And imagine the following description of what it takes to fulfill one's moral obligations to the extent that they couldn't do anything more to fulfill them better. So you can still go on fancy vacations and buy lavish things for the people you care about, as long as you make a donation of, say, at least $100 a year to prevent children from starving to death and suffering from extremely painful, curable diseases. We might not want to say that an individual who lives that way is bad, but I don't think anyone would possibly say that they couldn't live in a more moral way than they are. What failing to meet the extreme demand in fact means is that you are not morally perfect. You could do a better job of fulfilling your moral obligations. But this is a trivial point that few would challenge. In fact, it seems to me that no self-honest person could critically reflect on their lives and come to the conclusion that they could not possibly have behaved more morally. Where the issue with the extreme demand arises, and where it really does seem untenable, is in the claim that by failing to meet the extreme demand, one is not simply a non-ideal moral agent, but one is in fact immoral. But is it a necessary component of the extreme demand that by failing to meet it, one is an immoral person? I think the answer is no, and the reason is because an individual's moral status falls on a continuum. Categories can be useful shortcuts to describe a person's moral status, but in reality, moral status is a matter of degree. Setting two categories, moral and immoral, and making the requirement to be moral the same as the requirement of being an ideal moral being, as Singer has done, is both incorrect and intuitively absurd. If one understands the extreme demand as a necessary condition to be moral, the implication being that someone is immoral if they fail to meet it, then everyone would be immoral, and there would be nothing further to say. But of course, we want to say that if person A dedicates a substantial amount of time and money to good causes, although not enough to meet the extreme demand, presumably, and doesn't harm anyone, and person B doesn't harm anyone but lives in luxury and never gives any resources away to those in abject poverty, and person C is a criminal who actively interferes with other people's well-being, then person A is more moral than person B, who is more moral than person C. All three of them could be more moral as they could come closer to meeting the extreme demand, but to lump them all into the category of immoral is incorrect because morality is a continuum. It's continuous in nature. Using three categories, supererogatory, decent, and bad, is a better approximation for assessing individuals' moral statuses than just using two categories, but it still doesn't account for the wide range of differences within each category. What the extreme demand does is simply remind us that while we may think that what we are doing is good, we can always be better because morality is in fact a spectrum that we fall on. By critically reflecting on our positions in the world we live, the extreme demand may also shift our assessment of the boundaries between how we want to view the morality of an individual and of ourselves in a more onerous direction. It might remind us that we really do have so much compared to the poorest of the poor, and we should give more to help prevent children from dying agonizing deaths. The problems arise when the extreme demand is taken to be a condition for being moral at all. That is when absurd conclusions like buying a ribbon for your daughter's hair makes you immoral come into play. And there's some evidence to suggest that Singer himself would at least be sympathetic to this kind of reading of the extreme demand, even though he may not agree with it fully. At the end of his paper, One Community, after describing the extreme sacrifices required to meet the extreme demand, he suggests a figure of 1% of one's income for everyone with disposable income as being a figure that an individual must spend in order to not be a morally repugnant person. As he says, to give that amount requires no moral heroics. To fail to give it shows indifference to the indefinite continuation of dire poverty and avoidable poverty-related deaths. So Singer acknowledges that someone who gives 1% is better than someone who doesn't give at all. Presumably, he would then say that someone who gives 5% is better than someone who gives 1%, even though in all likelihood they still fall short of meeting the extreme demand. Even the language he uses of moral heroics suggests that there is an amount that someone could give that would make that individual morally praiseworthy, despite the fact that even this amount likely falls short of the extreme demand. Singer's requirement on what that amount should be is undoubtedly far greater than it would be for most people, but it still exists. Even for Singer, moral blame and praise is a continuous concept, with the extreme demand highlighting what the extreme end of the praiseworthy side looks like. And because it's so difficult to meet, it tells us that we can always do better, not that we are immoral if we fail to meet it. What really drives the binary interpretation of the extreme demand, whereby those who meet it are moral, even though these people don't actually exist, and those who do not meet it are immoral, is Singer's notorious pond analogy. We not only want to say that the person who walks past the drowning child and does nothing to save them out of concern for something trivial, like the state of his shoes or the fact that they'll be late for work, we want to say that that person is not only failing to act in a way that is praiseworthy, but is in fact acting in a way that's blameworthy. They're acting wrongly and are immoral. If the international aid case really does parallel the pond case, then it does seem like people who fail to meet the extreme demand are turning away from the drowning child in favor of something that is trivial in comparison, and so we must say that they too are acting wrongly and are immoral. There have been many attempts to draw disanalogies between the international aid case and the pond case. Most involve the idea of certainty. And as Addison says, quote, "One of the things that makes the pond case so powerful is the knowledge that without the agent's action, the child will die. But this knowledge is itself powerful because one assumes that the child has no other, no better means available to survive. If I do not wade in to rescue the child now, the child will die. But such knowledge is absent in overseas aid cases. In the pond case, you can be certain that your action would save someone's life, whereas you can't have the same degree of certainty when dealing with international aid. This point may or may not be true and or relevant in distinguishing the two cases, and I'll leave it up to the reader to make that judgment for themselves. But suffice it to say that I do think if you do your research, which the extreme demand would require that you do, you can find ways to save a child overseas from starvation or from extreme suffering with a extremely high degree of certainty. So I'd like to draw on a different disanalogy, which is unquestionably true and requires the pond case to be reconceived if it's going to instruct our intuitions in the case of international aid. There's an assumption in the pond case that once the individual saves the drowning child, they no longer have a responsibility to save any more drowning children, and that they can then go on with their lives as normal. One event that tested their moral character arose, they passed the test, and now they can return to their own personal projects. But this is not the case in terms of international aid. With international aid, we're constantly in a state where we are faced with choosing to save the life of the drowning child or between our personal projects. So the appropriate analogy is that an individual is always in very close proximity to a pond where there are an indefinite number of children that are drowning. And no matter how much of their resources an individual dedicates to saving drowning children, there will always be more to save. So properly understanding what the pond analogy actually looks like in terms of international aid, we can see that it actually supports the interpretation of the extreme demand as a condition for being a morally perfect being, not just being a moral one. The morally perfect being would dedicate their entire life to saving drowning children, leaving only personal time that's essential for bodily maintenance, survival, and securing more resources for themselves so that they can do a better job of saving more drowning children in the future. But I doubt many of us would have the intuition that someone who falls short of this standard is acting wrongly or is an immoral person. If someone in this scenario, say, saves 5 drowning children per day and then goes on with their lives and pursues other projects, which are, we can admit, of considerably less moral importance than saving the life of a child, we would probably like to say that that individual is at least a morally decent being, perhaps even a morally praiseworthy being, despite the fact that they fall short of meeting the extreme demand. So when the analogy is understood properly, we see that it in fact supports the idea that a person's moral status lies on a continuum, with the extreme demand being the condition for the extreme end of the praiseworthy side for morality. So I think that is going to do it for this episode. Singer's extreme demand is an extremely thought-provoking, paradoxical argument, so I hope that you found this discussion helps make some sense of it, and it might help you look at it in a more intuitive way as a condition for being a morally perfect being, not as a condition for being good at all. And if this was your first exposure to Peter Singer, I would highly suggest reading some of his work. He's kind of ruthlessly moral, if you will, but whether you love his work or hate it, it certainly makes you examine your own life and think on what you can do better. Thanks for listening. If you haven't yet done so, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out Piercing the Veil on iTunes and the other major podcasting platforms. Take care out there, and I look forward to the next discussion.